Good evening. Welcome back to the Deep 404. A US intelligence document has come out which lets us estimate the number of Ukrainian losses in this conflict. This document has come out in the last few days. It has been reported on quite a bit, and it mentions that there are 315,000 Russian casualties. Now, exactly how these numbers are estimated and come at, I'm not entirely sure, but this is US intelligence assessment. So I want to work through this, and let's use this. Let's accept this number from the United States. Try and put some logic around it. Try and figure out what the Ukrainian losses might be. So this intelligence assessment is saying that the Russians have lost 315,000 men killed or wounded in this conflict. So we need to break that 315,000 up. I'm going to use the BBC Mediazona numbers to work out what we think the numbers killed might be, and then we can subtract that from the 315,000 to get what the numbers wounded are. Looking at the numbers, when we get to the results, personally, I think the killed number is probably accurate. I think the wounded number is probably high. But let's just work through this. So if you're not aware of BBC Mediazona, I'm just going to read a little bit from their website here. In collaboration with Meduza and Dmitry Kobak, a researcher of excess mortality and machine learning lecturer at the University of Tübingen, has developed a method to estimate Russian wartime casualties, relying solely on publicly accessible records from the National Probate Registry and the data from the Federal State Statistics Service, Rosstat. So these numbers may or may not actually be a good modelling, but let's just assume that they are, because they're the best sort of quantitative, most informative type of data we have for this at this stage. So some of the numbers they suggest. In 2022, Russia lost 25,000 men killed. So that's about 83 per day in 2022. They say that by May 2023, they estimate the numbers had increased to 47,000, and that they believe they were between 40,000 and 55,000. That's by May 2023. So in those 5 months, January, February, March, April, May, there had been an increase of between 15 and 30,000 more deaths. These numbers do not take into account the losses of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. If we assume the lower level, that 40,000 had died by May, then that's about 100 a day. If we go to 55,000, that means that in 2023, it increased from 83 per day to between 100 and 200 a day, maybe averaging at 150 killed per day. If we then take, let's just say, I'll take the lower level to begin with. Let's just say we take 100 per day as the Russian losses per day based upon the first 5 months of 2023. If we take the remaining 7 months, that's 7 months at 100 per day, that would be another 21,000. So that would bring us up from 40 or 55,000 to 61 or 76,000 killed. If we then use that rate again of 100 a day, add on another 6,000 for January and February of 2024, then we are looking at somewhere between 67 and 82,000 Russian deaths for that period of time. And if we average out 67 and 82, we get an average of 75,000. So we could say that the Russian losses have been 75,000. Now, this doesn't take into account the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. That doesn't really necessarily matter for what are we going to do here to try and calculate the Ukrainian numbers. But if it does, you might want to add on, another 30% or say, and so you might even take that up to 100,000. You say 25,000 killed in those groups in that period of time, so you've got 100,000 killed. That would also increase the number of wounded. So if let's just say we take the 75K, then of the US intelligence assessment, which says 315,000 total casualties, 75 of those killed. That leaves 240,000 wounded. I think the 240,000 wounded number is high, and I'll come to that at the end as to why. But let's say the 75k killed is about right. Then if we want to estimate Ukrainian numbers, I think we have to look at some of the differences on the battlefield and then eventually make a bit of a guess of how much impact that might have. So I'm going to start here just talking through some of the reasons why I believe that the Ukrainian numbers need to be higher than the Russian numbers, just by using pure mathematics and logic. We have confirmation from both Russian and Western and Ukrainian sources that Russia outmatches Ukraine in terms of artillery and artillery shells. We have reports from the West. I've gone back until September of 2023, from September through to October and November and through to now, showing a sustained rate of Russian fire of artillery shells of 20,000 or more shells a day. At some stages in 2023, it was getting up to 60,000 a day. Now, over that same period of time from September of last year, the Ukrainian number of shells fired per day across the front line have decreased from 6,000 or 7,000 down now to between 1,000 or 2,000. So if the Russians are now firing between 10 or 20,000 a day, and the Ukrainians are firing between 1 and 2,000, then there's a 10 to 1 or maybe even a 20 to 1, somewhere in there, difference in the amount of artillery that is being fired by Russia compared to what Ukraine is firing back. So that's one thing. Artillery pieces. Now, if you have a 10 or 20 to 1 overmatch in terms of artillery in counter-battery warfare, you would expect the other side to be losing their artillery pieces. Now, Ukraine has been supplied with a lot of artillery pieces, and they've lost a lot of artillery pieces, and they are no longer being supplied at anywhere near the rate that they were in 2022. So Ukraine is in a position where they are in a deficit of artillery pieces compared to Russian artillery pieces. So we've got those two factors. Air support. Russia is able to provide close air support for its frontline troops. This is a combination of both helicopters, larger reconnaissance drones, and jet aircraft, fighter bombers and attack aircraft. We see Fab 500s, bombs and things like this being dropped all the time. There are reports that 60 or more of them are dropped a day in Avdeevka, in just one area. We have missile capability that the Russians have, which the Ukrainians don't have. We have almost daily missile and drone strikes by the Russians on the Ukrainian logistics, transport networks, their ammunition dumps, their assembly, repair, fabrication and manufacturing factories in Ukraine, train lines, all of these sort of things, and multiple missile strikes on concentrations and deployments of troops, and quite often officer and mercenary level troops. Ukraine is not able to reply with this. Ukraine does no longer have a functioning air force. They have some Su-34s who occasionally, maybe once a month, are able of launching some Storm Shadow missiles at Russia. But this is nothing in comparison to what is coming on a nightly basis from the Russians in terms of drones and missile strikes. And on the front line, there's just nothing from Ukraine in terms of close support for their frontline fighters. So we've got those differences. The Russians have got the TOS 1 and 2, the Solnet spec heavy flamethrower systems. These are the big thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems. The Ukrainians have no response for these, and these are devastating weapons. They don't need to be pinpoint accurate because the way they operate is that when they land, they explode into an expanding ball of gas, which fills an area, and then that ignites, and that gas flows into trenches and through doorways and through windows of vehicles and burns and sends a pressure shock wave through anything that's soft and fleshy in the area. The Ukrainians do not have this. The Ukrainians do not have this missile capability. They do not have the helicopter or fixed wing capability in this conflict. The Russians also have now, reaching the front lines, their newly upgraded Koalitia self-propelled artillery piece, which has a range of 70 kilometres. There's nothing that the Ukrainians have at this stage that's firing artillery at that distance. It's not really until 2025 that NATO is likely to come out with something that will reach that range in terms of their self-propelled artillery. Electronic warfare. The Russians have demonstrated over the last couple of weeks, but even over the last couple of years they've demonstrated this, but in the last couple of weeks and months they've demonstrated over the area of the Suwalki Gap between Poland and Lithuania their ability to suppress GPS in large areas. Now, who knows when that may also be being used in Ukraine to cause problems with Ukrainian ability to navigate. But we do have reports from Ukrainian sources of them being impacted by Russian electronic warfare countermeasures. Reports of their drones not flying and not reaching their targets and equipment not working. Dima from the Military Summary Channel, who collects really good temporal information. Every day he's building a database of geolocated videos across the front line. And so he can roll through his map backwards and forwards through time and get an idea of what's happening over time and trends. He has identified areas on the front line where there are surprisingly no video reports of Ukrainian drone strikes, FPV drone strikes. These is an indication that the Russians are using electronic warfare measures and they're being successful in those areas. The Russians have Lancets. Now, just today, I've seen reports that the Ukrainians are developing their version of the Lancet, but that's now 2 years into this conflict, and the Russians have been using the Lancets throughout the conflict. So there are all of these technical and logistical advantages that Russia has in this conflict. On top of that, the check, the sanity check, or the sniff test, if you like, of this is what is happening on the front line. And what is happening on the front line now is that Russia is taking small tactical advances all across the front line. And in the last couple of days, that has been increasing even more so. So the final factor that I think in here that Russia has in over Ukraine is morale. The Ukrainian offensive never breached the Surovikin line. It got as far as Verbova, and that was it. It didn't get past it. There were massive losses for the Ukrainians in terms of equipment. There was a failed offensive. The Russians held it back and now are advancing. Bakhmut has fallen to the Russians, Marinka has fallen, and now Avdeevka has fallen. So the Russian confidence and morale is high. All of these factors together, I would suggest and estimate, and you can make your own number here, but I would suggest that this would give the Russians more than a 2-to-1 advantage. I would conservatively suggest that this might give them a 4-to-1. So that 4-to-1 advantage in terms of losses, a 4-to-1 ratio. So for every 1 Russian lost, 4 Ukrainians would be lost. And I say this because if you're on the front line and you don't have air support, then you see what happened in Bradley Square around Orikov coming down to Robotny there, where the NATO tanks, the Leopards on debut, were all destroyed. And there were large pile-ups of NATO equipment because they didn't have the air support. Now, the Russians do have the air support, as we've discussed. So, if I'm going to assume here a 4-to-1 ratio. So if we have say the 75,000 Russians killed, and if you want to increase that to, let's say, 100,000 to include the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, their fighters, just as an estimate, 100,000, then if we multiply that by 4, we're looking at somewhere between 300 and 400,000 killed Ukrainians in this conflict. And if the number's even higher, if the ratio is higher, it's possible it is. If it is, it might be 500,000 Ukrainians killed in this conflict. Now, the number of wounded is very high. If you multiply out that 4-to-1 ratio against the 240,000 taken from the US intelligence report for the Russian losses, you end up getting near 1 million wounded. And this is my reasoning for thinking why that might be high, because that sounds like so many wounded. But maybe it is the case. But people, when I've mentioned this, I mention this on my X now, when I'm on X and I talk about this, if people bring this topic up, I often hear people say, oh, you're talking out of your ass, because everyone knows that when you're attacking, you lose 3 times as many men when you're attacking. Now, what people are saying here, I think, is that they're misunderstanding a military doctrine which suggests that if you are trying to attack and take a position, that it doesn't say that you will lose 3 times as many men you're attacking. What it says is that to ensure the likelihood of you taking that position, you should start the attack with 3 times as many men. And if you do, then you're guaranteed pretty much of taking the position. And the assumption and caveat in this is that both sides are equal. In you're attacking, they're defending, you've got close air support, they've got close air support, you've got air defense, they've got air defense, you've got artillery, they've got artillery. Everything else being equal, if you want to try and take those positions, they're suggesting that you should start with 3 times as many troops. I think this gets misinterpreted, and people have turned this into, oh, when you're attacking, you lose 3 times as many men. So first of all, I think that assumption, that claim is just incorrect. But if you do want to use that logic and rely on that logic and say, well, the Russians are losing 3 times as many men because they're attacking, well, then you've got to consider that for half of this conflict, the Ukrainians have been on the attack. The Ukrainians were on the offensive all through June up until October of last year. So surely by that logic, for that period of time, the Ukrainians have been losing at least 3 times as many men as the Russians. The Russians were defending. The Russians were defending in their buffer zone. They weren't even defending behind their real defensive areas. The Ukrainians, as I say, only ever touched it at Verbova, never breached it. So if that is the case, when Ukraine is attacking, and if they're attacking without air support and with a 10-to-1 disadvantage in artillery, and without the electronic warfare, and without the TOS-1 flamethrowers and these sort of things, then surely the Ukrainians, when they're attacking, are losing more. 4-to-1, 5-to-1, 8-to-1, who knows? But by that logic, you would still have to argue the Ukrainians are losing more men than the Russians. Now, this, if we look forward from here, Russia is pressing their advantage now. Russia has taken Avdeevka. So in Donetsk, they are pushing the Ukrainians back. There are reports coming from Ukrainian channels that the preparations, the defensive preparations by Ukraine, are not adequate and not where they should be. And part of this has been because of the way that the funding was done. Funding was distributed out to civilian contractors to perform work, and a lot of the money was reportedly embezzled. The money was taken, the defensive positions weren't built, the concrete wasn't poured, the steel wasn't delivered, whatever it may be. So, and this is coming from Ukrainian Telegram channels. So if this is true, then as Avdeevka falls, as the Russians are now putting pressure on Robotne and on the Vremka ledge and on the eastern edge of the Novokhovka Dam under Zaporozhye, The troops that were pulled out by Siersky from Zaporozhye to go and be chewed up in Avdeevka, the 3rd Brigade, those ones that may have been loyal to Zaluzhny that Siersky wanted to deplete so as to keep President Zelensky happy and reduce the likelihood of a coup, they have been pulled to Avdeevka. They have been routed there and they've lost many men. The reporting from the Russian Ministry of Defense is that yesterday was the most deadly day for Ukraine in this conflict. They're reporting that Ukraine lost 2,600 men yesterday along the front line. Now, if you follow this channel, you know I often cover the Russian Ministry of Defense figures. Through the last 8 weeks, we've had a few days where the number has reached over 1,000 estimated. Now, again, this number, you might say, well, that's Russian Ministry of Defense numbers, so just throw it out, don't worry about it. However, a Ukrainian former prosecutor general and current member of the Rada, the parliament in Ukraine, he himself has come out about a month ago and stated that he believes the Ukrainian losses are 1,000 a day, killed and wounded. So if these defensive positions aren't strong, with the breach of Avdeevka and the drive up towards Berychi and then to Pokrovsk, driving down and cutting some of the access roads and meeting up where the forces from Zaporozhye are coming up, we may soon see that there is a crumbling of the Donetsk line. And if the Ukrainians don't have adequate defensive positions to fall back to, they will be fighting on the back foot. They will be fighting while running, while being pursued. And this is a dreadful way to fight, because you're not able to stop and solidify and repel and push back your enemy. So the likely losses for the Ukrainians, if this begins, will be very high. So if that continues, if the fighting continues like this, these numbers, as I've said, if we want to assume, let's just assume that the Russian killed are 100,000, then the Ukrainian numbers need to be at least 400,000 or 500,000 or possibly more killed by using this type of logic. Now, then the factor mightn't be quite right, but by looking at all those things we talked about, artillery pieces, artillery shells, air support, bomb capability, missile capability, FPV drones being supplied directly from China and Russia manufacturing their own drones. Remember, Russia has a population of 140 million people. It has moved itself onto a war footing. It's got the lowest unemployment rate it's had. It's got skilled worker shortages because everyone is working to drive the war domestically. So with all of these sort of things happening, it feels to me like it's got to be a number more than 2, more than 3 larger in terms of that ratio. And if that is the case, if the Ukrainians are now being routed and are being pushed back without defensive positions, then this ratio will grow. Finally, I just want to finish off this with a comment from Rob Bauer, who's the chief of the NATO Military Committee. He says, in military terms, this is talking about Avdeevka. In military terms, this is a small loss. They destroyed the entire infrastructure. That's why there is no city. It's just another couple of 100 meters. It isn't just a couple of 100 meters. It's kilometers that the Russians advanced yesterday west of Avdeevka, and they are making those type of advances in other areas on the lines now. We're hearing they're making strong advances in Robotny, Verbova area. If this continues and the morale of the Russians is up and the morale of the Ukrainians is low because of Avdeevka and the reversing of the gains that were hard fought for in the offensive around the Veremka Ledge and Robotny, if they are lost within the next few days and weeks, then I think the Ukrainian losses will continue to be tragically high. Okay, I'm going to leave that there. If you're enjoying the channel and you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. If you think you know someone who would enjoy the channel, please share it with them, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.